Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Sheikh, the Day School, Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanofsky in New York City, Anshe Chesed, but on sabbatical, but still with us because Torah doesn't take a sabbatical. Studying Torah doesn't take it. And neither does Parsha Talk. Parsha Talk doesn't take sabbaticals. Parasha Emor, which is an amazing Parsha this week. Emor, we are still 1 week behind Israel. I call it the Jewish limp. Israel is one step. Anyway. Emor deals with kohanim, the priesthood. The first rules are about relating to the dead, that the kohanim have certain restrictions to their lives, specifically in the way they conduct themselves around the dead. Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanofsky, being our resident Kohen, could you reflect on this, both professionally, personally, and in any way you would like? What does it mean to be a Kohen?
Yeah, first of all, it is tremendously interesting topic because of its anachronism. The reason that a Kohen is supposed to not have any contact with the dead, and then there's other restrictions about their marital lives. A regular Kohen is not supposed to marry a divorcee, and the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to, but can marry a widow. But the Kohen Gadol is supposed to not marry either a divorcee or a widow. There's supposed to be some sort of avatars or paragons of purity because they're serving in the Beit HaMikdash, and they need to be like examples of the world as it is put together and orderly, and all of those things that are more complicated are disorderly. The Kohen is also described that there's all kinds of physical imperfections that would disqualify a Kohen. I think that those things typically sit very poorly with people nowadays. We are accustomed nowadays to thinking, that people, it's as the John Legend song goes, it's with your perfect imperfections. It's our imperfections that make us special, and not some sort of impossible standard of perfection. That's like a trap. But I think that the Bible assumes that Kohanim have to be physically perfect, have to be ritually pure, so they can't come in contact with the dead. But here's a cool exception. It's important, as emerges from the rabbi's reading of this first verse. Speak to the Kohanim, Emor al Kohanim bnei Aaron ve'amarta lehem lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. Do not impurify yourself for any dead body among your people. And the rabbis read that among your people, meaning that's when there are families. But if there's some terrible circumstance in which there's an abandoned corpse that doesn't have anybody to bury that person, that is just seen as the worst thing, the worst abjection to have a human body putrefy in public, which is like going to be horrifying. So a Kohen, even though they have this typical status, sometimes they find themselves in an emergency. Also, this is true, by the way, of a Nazirite. A Nazirite has made this vow to not have any contact with the dead. You know what? In an emergency, you got to drop everything, and you have to deal with this. I find this a tremendously, ethically inspiring. There's all kinds of things that we don't want to do, right. But when in real emergency situations, and somebody is all abandoned, even if it's a dead body, but you got to come through. And I take that.
So in other words, the ritual life is colliding with the ethical and the dignity, the preservation of the dignity of human being, as understood in the most basic terms, which is if you see a dead human being, you have to tend to it. Right. Under normal circumstances, there are societies and there are individuals detached, deployed for that. But in the extraordinary circumstance, this obligation for human dignity outweighs your kohanim. Barry, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you were talking, it seems like there's an identification with purity, with Torah and absolute life. And that what we regard as impurity, what the Bible regards as impurity, are situations where some element of death either is introduced or threatens. And what I think that this partially explains why the Kohen has more restrictive rules when he comes into contact with death. And it led me to think, while you were talking about the Meit Mitzvah, this obligation to bury the dead, which falls upon anyone who comes across a corpse, is what makes that different, I think, is that part of life on some level is also attending to the dead. That it's not a complete separation from death, as we sometimes think, but sometimes we have to attend to the dead in order to truly live.
I just want to make one comment about the way we have phrased this. I want to make one comment about like how it is that we talk about rules. And I'm just going to present two options and see which sits better with you or whatever. Is it that the rule is that the Kohen Gadol or the Kohanim don't have any contact with dead bodies, but in emergency situations, the rules lapse? Or is it that the rule of how the Kohen avoids contact with the dead, the rule includes the exception for dealing with a Meit Mitzvah? In other words, what I'm saying is, the way we look at it, do we end up saying, okay, these are the rules we try to follow, but sometimes something more important happens and the rules are set aside? Or do we say that the way halakha works is it includes its own limitations? Is it forbidden to drive a car on Shabbos? Yes. Is it forbidden to drive an ambulance on Shabbos? No. Is that the rules are superseded, or is the rule itself include a life-saving provision?
Right. And I guess it's, you could say we suspend the rules for the sake of life, or the rule is you got to save a life on Shabbos.
Well, I think what it comes down to is a famous phrase, "Uvacharta b'chayim," that you have to choose life. That what we sometimes lose sight of in our daily lives is that all of these rules are dedicated to increasing life and the life force of the universe. I remember hearing Rabbi Irving Greenberg talk once at a cloud conference, and his basic position was that life is on the increase in the universe. And that, if I'm not misquoting him, ultimately the universe will become totally enlivened, which is a beautiful image to think about. I remember when I was a physics student that what was on the increase was entropy, the slide into chaos. And Rabbi Greenberg's image was the direct opposite of that. And let's face it, a lot more hopeful than this idea that the end of the universe is complete dissolution. I'd much rather believe like Rabbi Greenberg. And I think that it helps us address your point, is that these exceptions are not really exceptions, but they're just a different way of framing the emphasis on life.
Well, okay, so and the Kohanim are entrusted with maintaining that sense of order in their local universe, in their in the community and in the nation. Following on the theme of Kiddoshim, they are Kiddoshim Yihiyu. It's not Kiddoshim Tihiyu. You shall be. It's they shall be holy, and they represent the ordering principle within the community. They stand for all the things that are going to bring that community towards more alignment. One more point I want to say is that we make a lot of interesting theories about the development of Judaism within the Crucible of Egypt, which is a society, a civilization dedicated to a religion of the dead, and how Judaism, biblical Israel, turns 180 degrees from that, formed or juxtaposed or adjacent to a society that worships the dead or is involved with the dead, whose priests are so connected to the rites of the dead. Here you have a priesthood that's dedicated to life. It's never it's an idea that always, I think, inspires imagination.
Can I say a word about one more thing about Kohen? We Kihuna, I feel like, generally speaking, American Jewish life, certainly in the way our conservative communities practice it, pushes up against hierarchy. We don't like hierarchy too much. We want people
Equality.
have equal access and and like in principle, a hereditary priesthood is not so it's not so democratic. It's pretty hierarchical. You're just born a certain way. And so I'm not crazy about the various manifestations of Kohanic authority and everything. And in my synagogue we don't do this. Many other synagogues, of course, still do on the Shalosh Regalim and the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. They have the priestly blessing.
We do it.
In Israel, you have it every day, and I love going to synagogue in Israel and reciting the priestly blessing. It's got a mystical kind of a magical tone. The kohanim are up there with the talitot over their heads, and their hands are in the special posture of blessing. And I must say that the experience of it, especially when I'm blessed to be able to do it with my kids, when I've done it here in the United States, I have my girls too. But of course, in an Orthodox synagogue in Israel, it's me and my boys. It is amazing. It is a feeling that you are a channel for blessing. It is a feeling that you have beneficence and generosity flowing through you as you look out at the community who themselves have the talitot over their heads and say, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God take care of you and bless you and smile upon you and radiate light upon you and grant you peace. I feel like when I do that at the beginning of a day, I'm getting a pill of generosity, beneficence, kindness, goodwill, and v'heyeh bracha, baby, be a blessing. I feel like the blessing is sent through my hands.
The two of us have Kohen envy. Go ahead, Baron.
So I just wanted to add a point. In Sefer Shmo, we're called upon to be a mamlachet kohanim, a kingdom of priests. And I think that in light of our conversation, what we can say is that this kingdom of priests doesn't mean that each of us is a priest, but that we live in the ambiance of the priesthood.
Nice.
And what I like about the priesthood is that we recognize in other spheres of life that people are different. Some people are gifted athletes. Some people have a gift for music, for writing, whatever it is. And we accept that. We don't think that because someone is a much better athlete than us, that we're somehow deficient or that there's something wrong with the athlete. But we learn how to rejoice in other people's accomplishments and endowments from which ultimately we think come from God. And I think part of what makes a priesthood beautiful, even in a democratic age, is it gives us a way to recognize that in our communities in our kingdom of priests, we're not all the same, but in fact, we embrace those differences. And those differences are sometimes physical and sometimes they're metaphysical, but they're all important to keep.
So in a way, and without going too much on a limb, this may help us understand the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is really, I joked about, envy and its jealousy. It's rooted in that inability to accept difference and inability to accept the uniqueness and the role, rather than saying, wow, the Jewish people have this, long relationship and special history and are a source to be admired and even emulated, or certainly to adapt to a posture of affection. The opposite has been true throughout history, and so within the Jewish people we have the opportunity to display that. We can adore and admire our kohanim because of the responsibilities that are placed upon them, and truly be better off for that. I always like to return, for me the first words to God to Abraham, you'll be a blessing, right? I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, right? So to admire those who have the capacity for bringing blessing into the world makes you blessed. It brings blessing to you, right? And one of the blessings of the Jewish people is the Jewish calendar, which we should turn to now for the second half of our talk, which starts in chapter 23 of Leviticus, the Parasha Emor. And it may be still familiar to us because we read some of these passages not too long ago. The passage is the introduction to the calendar, basically, the festivals. Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel, Vamarta alehem mo'adei Adonai. This is my fixed times, my mo'adim. It actually, mo'adei Adonai, it just says holidays. Asher tikru otam mikrai kodesh, that you declare them as holy days, or as days, sacred occasions, hey mo'adai. So I want to really parse that verse a little bit for you, offer the following, which is that there's something called Mo'adei Adonai, and there's something called Mo'adei Adam, okay? And that a calendar is very much a composite. A calendar is a cultural artifact. A calendar is a cultural creation. In antiquity, I guess calendars were made by human beings, basically, or calendars were made in response to the narrative of the gods, right? So, and we have vestiges of that today, because the days of the week are named for different gods, Sunday, or different planets, and Saturday.
Saturday, yeah.
Right, mercredi in French for Wednesday, right? Lundi is the Monday, moon, right, etc. So the proposition that I'd like you to argue, or just to think about, is, what is it about the calendar? The calendar is such an important tool of our life. I don't think any of us could live a day without the necessity of consulting a calendar in some ways. And how do you relate to the calendar? And what does the sacred calendar of Israel tell us in theology or in story? Barry.
So, a very nice question, Elliot, I must say. I think that the calendar teaches us about the responsibility of the partnership between God and human beings, that both are essential elements. And one of the things I like to teach my ninth grade kids in rabbinics is that most of the units of time that we have are based on astronomical phenomena: the day, the month, and the year. The one thing that is not based on an astronomical phenomenon, but is almost universally observed, is the week. And a 7-day week is not part of the fabric of the universe, although that's what we think of as Jews. But there's no way that you would know that it is Shabbat if you did not know when the previous Shabbat was, or that today was Friday, which is not true of the passage of the other times. And it's interesting that in our list of calendrical list here in Vayikra Tav Gimel, we begin with Shabbat,
Exactly.
which is not a Moed, which
Right.
is, the scholars, take note of that. And then it goes on to what we call the historical holidays,
So,
Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And what I wanted to point out is that all of these holidays have a basis in agriculture, which is not fixed, right? Most harvest holidays happen right after the harvest, and the harvest comes at a slightly different time every year. But now what we have in Vayikra is a complete fixing of the holidays except for Shavuot. That Pesach sacrifice is going to be offered on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, and the holiday of Matzot is going to begin on the 15th. Rosh Hashanah is going to take place on the 1st of Tishrei, Yom Kippur on the 10th, Sukkot on the 15th. And those are fixed. And in the Mishnah, this is elaborated on. There's a wonderful story about Rabbi Joshua and Rabban Gamliel, where Rabbi Joshua is consoled by Rabbi Akiva, who tells him that the holidays are whenever the Jews and their court says that they are. It's not based on an absolute datum that the new moon was actually seen, but whatever the court says the new moon is seen, that's when it begins. And so it requires a human being to declare the calendar.
So I just want to react to the comment about Shabbat, because in the Parsha here, the only day of Moed, which is not Moed, but the only sacred day which is not declared, right? Asher tikru otam mikra kodesh, you will declare them, hey moadai, they are my times. And then it goes, sheshet yamim te'aseh malacha, 6 days you will do or work shall be done over Yom Shavi'i, in the seventh day, Shabbat Shabbaton Mikra Kodesh, a day of complete rest. Kol melacha lo ta'asu, all work shall not be done. Shabbat hi l'Adonai, Sabbath to God, b'chol moshvotechem, everywhere. You don't need to declare it. I think I'm dovetailing with what you said. Shabbat transcends the declaration of a court. Shabbat happens with or without the court. I studied this week with my class, and there's the lovely sugya about what happens when you forget. What happens when you forget? You're walking
You're lost in the desert.
away, or you're in the desert,
Yeah.
and you forgot that it's Shabbat. When do you make Shabbat? It's such a great question. And so the answer, the halachic answer, where one says you count from the time you remember and then make the seventh day Shabbat. The other one is you make the day that you remember Shabbat and then count after that. And one to recall creation and one to recall Adam HaRishon. And the halacha follows creation. That is, the minute you remember, that's your day one. Such a fascinating, beautiful idea, which says exactly as you said, Barry, that the 7-day rhythm is fundamental to the universe, and that even if you forget it, it's fundamental to human civilization, to humanity, to my humanity, never mind my Jewishness, and that I have to maintain a 7-day rhythm to synchronize myself, or attempt to synchronize myself with both society and the universe. Jeremy, you have something.
Two things. First of all, our listeners maybe intuited this thing that we're saying now about the difference between the kind of absolute rhythm of Shabbat and the socially conventional rhythm of the holidays that are human defined. In the blessings that we say in the Amidah or in Kiddush on the holidays, it's Mekadesh HaShabbat or Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, that God sanctifies the Shabbat on God's own calendar, or Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, God sanctifies the people with a system, and then they sanctify the local calendar. And so therefore you have this, if it's Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's Mekadesh HaShabbat v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. So we have this liturgy encoding of this idea that we're talking about now. I'm feeling a little like Rabbi Yehoshua in the story that Barry was talking about. I'm feeling a little bit of frustration with the tradition's answer, or Rabban Gamliel in that story, after he forces Rabbi Yehoshua to violate the Yom Kippur that he thinks would be based on his obviously correct reading of the astronomical calendar. He's clearly right. Rabban Gamliel gets the last word, and he says, you are my master and my student. You're my student with respect to accepting my authority because I'm the boss. And you are my master in wisdom because you were right. You're right about the issue. And I'm finding myself feeling frustrated with a purely conventional, the truth is whatever the authority says the truth is, implication. I want religion. I certainly recognize that lots and lots and lots of stuff we say in religion is conventional. It's by agreement. There are plenty of philosophers like the late Richard Rorty who thought that anything was true or false based on what people generally agreed to, that there wasn't some external standard. I find that absurd, and I want there to be some external yardsticks that are not merely whatever the ones that we come up with, but it's a I guess dialectical tension in Judaism of what's the world out there and what's the culture in here, and how do those two things hook onto each other.
Fascinating.
I want to offer a defense of Rabban Gamliel. I just taught this the other day, and what occurs to me is that Rabban Gamliel perhaps gets a bad rap in the story because he's not necessarily dismissing the fact, he's accepting the testimony of the witnesses that came. And we were talking before the show how the whole idea of witnesses coming to Jerusalem to announce that they have seen the new moon is a little bit odd, because you would think that there are plenty of people in Jerusalem who could have seen the new moon just as easily as the people who are coming to testify. And the Mishnah indicates that perhaps these witnesses are coming are not among the educated classes. But what Rabban Gamliel is saying is they're part of our community, and so what they testify becomes the law. It's not us who actually know better. And I agree with you, Rabbi Joshua, that we know better, but that these witnesses who come are part of our community and we have to show them respect. It's really a part, I think, of inclusion. And perhaps Rabbi Joshua is a bit of an elitist. We know he comes across that way in the story of Tenor Sholachnai. And that while Rabban Gamliel, who is an elitist in other stories, but not here, I think, is trying to suggest that our model for community is to be more inclusive rather than less inclusive.
Well, maybe what this is trying to suggest, and maybe underpinning all of this, is not only questions of, when, it's questions of authority, and prevention of anarchy, but also to say, how are we going to stay one community? We need one calendar. We need one centralized calendar. In fact, the history of the Jewish calendar moves into the direction such that we don't have to rely on witnesses anymore. We have all the astronomical calculations. We know that a molad, the birth of a new moon, happens every 29 days and so many hours and so many seconds, and then you simply add it from one to the next, and that certain months get doubled up, and with 2 Rosh Chodesh days, and certain months are not, and that there are certain conventions. All of that became part of the calendar, and that the calendar shapes your identity. The calendar, especially today, because we live in a world in which we are operating at least under 2 calendars as Jews. I mean, today, is a calendar day. We're recording this on May the 11th. It's the 10th of ER, right? So we're always bifurcated as Jews. We have our lives under certain cycles. Israel, right? We are Parasha Emor this week. Israel is already at Bahar. And we are, in the Omer period. And so, but we're also in this pre-Memorial Day period. We live a very kind of schizophrenic life, and the calendar is a perfect illustration of that. And we all tell our birthdays on the secular calendar, but we don't realize to what extent that has absorbed us. I'm mentioning this because I've been studying and reading this book about the Holocaust Jewish calendars, and I shared some of it with a class this week, and saying how important it was in a world that was completely chaotic for Jews who were under so much persecution and pain of death, to try and remember what day it was. And there's lots of heroic stories about, finding materials and writing and disseminating calendars, and how important it was for people to know what day was Shabbat, what day was Rosh Chodesh. I mean, there's a heroic story of someone saying, today you say V'tein Talamatar, right? Like
it's funny. It's funny that you pointed out the birthday thing. So as we're recording this, today happens to be Yedidia's birthday on the Hebrew calendar. I just know because it's 25th the Omer, and his birth was on Lag BaOmer, and but we of course celebrate his birthday on the English on secular calendar, and of course I'm a synagogue rabbi, so it happens all the time.
Right.
That we tell somebody such and such is the yard site, and they tell me, well, I observe the secular date, and I'm gonna, whatever. I encourage people to do what works for them. It doesn't exactly sit right with me when that happens. Like I said, no, like observe the Hebrew calendar date, but I don't celebrate my birthday on my Hebrew calendar. I mark my birthday, or I think of my birthday or my family, my kids' birthdays on the secular date. How do those two things go together? Why is one seem realer and the other seems
celebrate 2 birthdays?
I could do that. I just another illustration of the point that I was making about the quote unquote reality-based calendar or the conventional-based calendar. I'm not in favor of getting rid of second day Yom Tov, because I think we've done enough, diminution of religious practice. I don't think that's necessarily wise. But the question that people always say, we don't need a Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot. We don't need a second day of Yom Tov in the diaspora, because we know when the real Rosh Chodesh is. And that's a question that emerges only if you have a sense that there's an astronomical reality that is the defining feature. If you say that it is a kind of a conventional thing, then the second day Yom Tov makes sense. And this year I had a one-day Yom Tov in Pesach. Kind of nice, actually.
Well, we follow the science. We don't follow the science.
We don't follow the science. Just put on your mask and take some ivermectin, whatever it's called, hydroxychloroquine.
Okay. Well, we don't have time to discuss the person who curses God. Sorry.
Maybe it's better.
Yamach
Sorry, but he actually, his name is mentioned, isn't it? He's
Shemo.
the son of what is his name? Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelit v'hu ben Ish Mitzri vayikov ben Isha Yisraelit. He's not even named.
Isn't it his mother Shemi Mo Shlomi Bat Dibri, right?
Good, you get the Bible quiz contest winner.
But you give us the midrash, right? Who is the Ish Mitzri? Who is his father? You told us this midrash.
I talked about this last year, I think, which was he's the guy. What is it? He's the
guy who Moshe killed.
He's the guy who Moshe killed. It all goes back to Moshe's to blame for everything. My God. Okay, but just you know what? Take a minute, because this little event tells us something about. It gives us an insight about Moses. Moses doesn't know what to do with him. So talk about.
So this is one of the cases in the Torah where something happens in the community and people approach Moses wondering what to do, and Moses' first response is, "I don't know. Let me go ask God." And our image, of course, and at least for me, since I was a little kid, is that Moses went up to Mount Sinai to find out everything that God needed to tell him. And then you open the Torah and you realize there are plenty of things that God left out for some reason.
Sure.
And one of the curiosities here is that the Torah, from one point of view, is mostly law. There is a good chunk of narrative as well. But all the case law are the cases where Moses didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
There's not a case where they said something happened. Oh, yeah, we look in Shemot. This is what we do it, and we move on. It's only these cases where Moses doesn't know. And one of the things that we often forget is that this is a great message for us, because we live our lives and we never always know what to do. And a lot of times we're befuddled. Sometimes we think less of ourselves for not knowing. But I think when these moments come, we have to remind ourselves that we are the descendants of Moshe, who also didn't know. And sometimes it would behoove us to find out how we can ask God.
So just as Moses was humble and didn't know, we should also be. And just as the study of Torah leads us to the discovery, so too we are thankful of having this opportunity to study together, to share our Torah with everyone, and to share the joy of these discoveries with everyone. We want to wish everyone a beautiful Shabbat. We thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.
Shabbat Shalom.
On another
Shabbat Shalom.
Parasha Talk. Shabbat Shalom.